Okay, so like I left off on the last video, I said we would start with civil rights origins here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the civil rights movement, and then we'll get into some of the stuff that actually happens in the civil rights movement. So first off, the civil rights movement isn't just in the 1950s and 1960s. You can really trace the origins back. I mean, some would trace it back to the U.S. Civil War. But I think the most famous case that people usually go back to is the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And again, you probably talked about this in civics. But this basically was the idea that, and they're talking specifically about trains when we talk about Plessy v. Ferguson. But it basically said that separate but equal facilities for blacks and whites were okay. What this is going to do, it's going to result in the Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws basically was basically it was legal segregation. However, it's not a national thing. These are regional within the country where certain states, certain communities would have segregation where they'd have actual laws. And basically, Plessy v. Ferguson made it so that it was okay to have those laws for segregation as long as everything was separate but equal. So you could have separate schools with the argument that both schools were equal. The reality is the schools weren't equal, but it put into place a legal system where that could happen. And this is really ultimately going to be what the center of the civil rights movement is going to be, is that there really is no such thing as separate but equal. And that we need to get rid of the idea of separate but equal, but the idea that just say that we're all equal versus, yeah, we can have separate locations, but we can have them be the same. No, everybody has access to the same stuff. So that's really sort of the heart of the modern civil rights movement. Executive Order 9981 was going to be the desegregation of the military. This happens in 1948. If you remember when we did World War II, we talked about how the military was segregated. But 1948, President Truman is going to desegregate the military. And that's again going to be another major step. And then, of course, Jackie Robinson, who I alluded to earlier, who was the first African American baseball player in Major League Baseball. Again, opening up that idea of desegregation. The idea that, we shouldn't have the Negro leagues in Major League Baseball. No, everybody should be playing in the same baseball league. And Jackie Robinson was one of the first people to do that. If you've never seen the movie 42, I would suggest taking a look at that movie, particularly if you have an interest in this topic. It's actually a pretty good movie. But you also get the idea that this was not easy for Jackie Robinson to do. This was not an easy transition to go from the Negro leagues to Major League Baseball. And there was many a time where he could very well have given up, but he chose not to, and he kept pushing forward. So again, these are the steps towards what will become the modern civil rights movement. 1954, Brown v. Board of Education. Basically what Brown v. Board of Education does is it overturns the Plessy v. Ferguson case. Basically, it says that you cannot argue that the schools are separate but equal. The schools everybody has to have equal access to the same schools. And this is 1954 that this is going to pass. It doesn't mean southern states and southern communities are going to open their schools up to everybody. That's not what happens. There's going to be a lot of fighting. A lot of different things are going to happen to make it so that education could be equal. Now, again, if we were in class, we would be talking about whether or not schools are still equal today, or, is there still a little bit of the separate but equal mentality in education? I would argue to an extent that we still lack equality in our schools, but that equality is not 100% because of race. That equality is more because of financial, that your wealthier towns are going to have better, stronger school districts than your poorer towns or your urban communities simply because of access to money. And that comes into question, is that a violation of civil rights? And if we were in school, we would have talked about that to see what you thought. But again, something to think about. Chief Justice Earl Warren, he was the Chief Justice, that as far as the Brown Board versus Board, I totally lost my train of thought for a second there. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when it came to Brown v. Board of Education, a major player in all this. And then, of course, Thurgood Marshall. He was the lawyer who argued for victory in the case, and he later went on to become the first African American to serve on the Supreme Court. So again, two of the most important legal people when it comes to the civil rights movement, Earl Warren and Thurgood Marshall. Again, here we go. This is where we start to talk about segregation in schools. You'll see here everywhere it's red. This is basically where you had legal segregation prior to Brown v. Board of Education. The states that are yellow did not have any legislation, meaning that there was no legal segregation. The reality is, if you look at the states that are yellow, you're probably not talking about the most diverse communities in the United States during this time period. The states that are blue have optional or limited segregation. And of course, the states that are green, segregation is illegal in schools. Okay, where they actually have laws that say you cannot segregate in public schools. However, like I said, there's going to be some other issues at play when we talk about public schools, particularly in some of the northern cities. But we'll talk about that later on. So again, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And that's what Brown v. Board of Education says. All right. Some of the key individuals that we need to look at when we talk about civil rights, Emmett Till. Emmett Till, if we were actually in school, we would have spent an entire class day talking about Emmett Till and his significance. Emmett Till was a young man, I should say a young boy. I mean, he was really a teenager, who had gone down south to visit his uncle. And he was accused of whistling at a white woman in a store. And he was basically taken from his uncle's home, and he was brutally murdered. And the thing with Emmett Till is he becomes sort of the symbol of what the civil rights movement will represent in the 1950s. Here is this young boy who really was completely innocent in all of this stuff, who was going to be brutally murdered. And when his body is sent back home to Chicago, which initially the sheriff did not want to send his body back home to Chicago. His mother insisted on it. His mother has a funeral for him where she has an open casket where you see his mutilated body, and she makes it all public. And this is where you get into the significance in the power of television and media in the civil rights movement. If you think about it, if there was no TV, if there was no media, we never would have seen what happened to Emmett Till. Therefore, people would not have been energized by Emmett Till. But because of that, because of the changes that occur in technology, now we have this symbol of civil rights that's going to inspire so many people. People that initially thought the civil rights movement was not about them. Now they start to see that it is, because this is about human beings. Rosa Parks. Of course, you guys all know about Rosa Parks. I'm not going to talk a ton about her because, you know, when you have February Black History Month and when you're in elementary school, she's one of the people that you all talk about. Of course, she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger. Because of that, you have the Montgomery bus boycott. And of course, this is probably where Martin Luther King Jr. really steps up as a major player in the civil rights movement too, along with Rosa Parks. The Little Rock Nine, this is where we talk about desegregation of schools. This is 1957. Little Rock High School, despite of Brown v. Board of Education, was still segregated. But there was a group of 9 black students who tried to enter the previously white school, and they were blocked. And they were blocked by students, by the police, by everything. Nobody would let them into the school. Despite of that, they kept showing up every day, despite the taunts and the threats of violence, to try and get into that school. Again, because of television, because of the news, because of media, President Eisenhower is going to be pressured into sending in federal troops to escort them into that school. Again, the power of this, the fact that people sitting home in Connecticut, sitting home in Maine, sitting home in Minnesota, people that never would have thought of the civil rights movement, never would have thought of segregation, now they're seeing Emmett Till, they're seeing Rosa Parks, they're seeing the Little Rock Nine, and this is starting to energize people. And people are starting to think, whoa, this isn't right. You also have to remember, we also just fought World War II. We fought World War II because we wanted to free people from the oppression of the Nazis. How could we go off and fight and die to free people from the oppression of the Nazis and oppress people in our own country? So again, it's not a coincidence that the civil rights movement happens when it happens. George Wallace, he's a major face of support of segregation. He was the governor of Alabama. He actually stood in the door of the University of Alabama to block admission of 2 African-American students. Alabama had actually been a segregated school. It was an all-white school. And because of the laws that were placed and the fact that Alabama was a state, the University of Alabama was a state school, a public university, they had to desegregate. And he actually blocked people from entering that building. The thing with George Wallace is he later reverses his stance on segregation. And he appoints a record number of African Americans to government positions. He does survive an assassination attempt, but he is permanently paralyzed because of that. But again, George Wallace becomes sort of that image of the changing face of the South. First, he's segregation. We're going to block the black students from getting into the school. And then he sort of shifts and he becomes a major voice for desegregation in the South. All right. There's George Wallace. That's the picture of him blocking the door to the University of Alabama. Okay. Orville Faubus. He's the governor of Arkansas. He was a segregationist, and he ordered the Arkansas National Guard to stop the nine young African-American students from going into Little Rock Central High School. President Eisenhower will eventually send the U.S. troops in. But again, you're looking at another major player here. And this is someone who is going to stand firm. He's going to dig his heels in support of segregation in America's schools. Lester Maddox, he was the owner of the Pickwick Cafeteria in Georgia. Maddox is going to challenge the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by refusing to desegregate it. He would not desegregate his restaurant. He is eventually elected governor of Georgia. He refused to lower his flags to half staff when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. He used filibusters in the Senate to try and prevent key civil rights legislation from getting passed in the state of Georgia. Again, he was one of the major forces against segregation. Eventually, we're going to have the Civil Rights Act of 1957 passed. So this is that first major piece of legislation. This is going to initiate a greater federal role. So this is saying that the federal government has, it's the job of the federal government to step in and help. It's the job of the federal government to ensure that equal rights are spread throughout the country. Of course, this was actually really sort of put into place by the amendments in the Constitution after the U.S. Civil War. And this is just sort of reiterating that. However, this particular act was fairly ineffective. It doesn't really do enough. And it's really ineffective simply because of what I just said. It doesn't do enough. They needed to do more for it to truly be effective. Okay, I'm going to pause here and then I'm going to pick up and